Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode of the Dairy Edge, we are focusing on winter milk, and dairy specialist Joe Patton gives guidelines for developing profitable systems. But first I asked him for an overview of winter milk production in Ireland.
So the broad outline of numbers on for winter milk would be, the last check would be there are about 1,800 registered liquid milk producers. So that would mean those farms would have a defined contract with their processor that determines, the number of litres, etc. There's about 1,700 of those that are producing for the fresh milk market. But also there's another sector there, which is an interesting group really. They're somewhere in the middle. They may not be contracted, but they're producing winter milk for a given market, I suppose, or for their own reasons within the year. So there's probably another 800 of those. So when you add it up between the two groups, you're probably talking somewhere around 2,200 to 2,400 dairy farms that are calving cows in the autumn to produce milk over the winter period.
And then in terms of performance on those farms, Joe?
The performance of those farms, it's something that when you look at the numbers, it's possibly quite surprising for people. Emma-Louise, like the average winter milk supplier output for say 2018 in terms of solids, it comes in at around 430 kilos of milk solids produced, around 5,500 kilos of milk. Okay, so that's ballpark where they're at. So that's relative to, let's say, for example, the spring calving herds are about 390 solids and about just under 5,000 kilos of milk delivered. So you're really talking about 40 kilos of milk solids higher than your average spring producer, and at 430. Now, the 430, while being higher than spring producers, they're not, even though I suppose the traditional perception of winter milk is that they're very high input, high output herds. The data would suggest that the output is relatively moderate on the average winter milk herd. Now, having said that, your top 10% of winter milk suppliers will be delivering over 530 kilos of milk solids, closer to 7,000 kilos of milk, which is really, which is decent performance overall. Okay.
And then if we look at, say, if I look back to the spring calving model, it's very much mimics grass growth and mirrors, the grass growth curve, and in terms of what our demand for cows and what they're eating is based on the grass growth model. What does the feed demand and the feed budget look like in a winter milk system?
Yeah, that's good. It's a good question, because the thing I suppose we need to remember with winter milk is that the contract conditions and the percentages of milk required over the winter period, etc., can be very variable depending on the processor and also depending on the individual contract. So there will be quite different, winter milk can be anything defined from calving 15% in the autumn up to, there's a small number of farms calving 100% in the autumn, but the average person is probably calving something around 35% of their herd in the autumn period. So that variation and that range does change it makes it more difficult in a way to define to define the individual system, I suppose. But look, in broad terms, I suppose what we have seen in terms of the profitability on the system is that what we've pushed people to do, and people that have control of the calving pattern have done this, is that you meet the requirements for you look at your contract, you define what your requirements are for winter milk to make sure you meet your premium and meet your supply requirements. And then after that you try whatever's left in terms of calving cows, you calve them to suit the grass profile. So, for example, your typical liquid milk herd with about 50% liquid milk contract that requires, for argument's sake, 1,000 litres a day over the winter period. You calve enough cows in the autumn to meet that, and then the remainder of the cows, you calve them to mimic really the compact spring calving system. So the principal thing to remember there is you sort of, particularly for liquid milk situation, you calve as many cows as you require to meet your individual contract, and then you manage the remainder of the herd to look like a compact spring system. And maybe one final point on that is that, it has happened over the years where perhaps late spring calving in winter milk herds has been tolerated, as in, April, May, June calvers, because they would be seen as cows that will fill contracts later in the season. But our numbers from a feed cost point of view would suggest that those are very expensive cows to feed and the production wouldn't be great. So the model for us would always be compact block in the autumn, starting sometime around mid to late September, depending on the thing, and then compact starting in late January, early February, with all cows done by the middle of April, really, for a winter milk system. Okay. Now, look, from a feed budget point of view, what does that mean? That really means that we have to make certain alterations, and we can be confident in that. Now, we probably don't build as much grass in the autumn period because we don't have the demand in the autumn and in the early season because of the fresh calvers. We don't build to a very high peak. We build to about 950, I suppose, of a farm cover. And in the autumn, in the spring, we try to open the farm with a high farm cover to suit feed demand for the herd going to grass in early spring.
When we look, Joe, you've compared, say, the average winter milk farmer with the top winter milk farmer. So what makes a winter milk farmer very good, compared with the average? Okay,
so there's a few things there. The first thing to say that, our top 10% farmers would have higher milk solids output, so they'll be doing 90 kilos of milk solids extra, or maybe, in litres terms, they're doing close to 7,000 litres versus the average, which is doing 5,500 litres. So their output is good. But the critical point is on that is that it's not output driven by high input, Emma-Louise. It's actually, when you look at the numbers on it, the feed cost on a per cow and per litre basis is actually quite similar, if not lower, on the high output farms. So the key point there is that the high efficiency winter milk farms are producing close to 100 kilos of milk solids for about the same amount of purchased concentrate, which is around the 1.3 to 1.4 ton of concentrate in a normal year. So, that's the key point. We're not talking about maximising milk production through additional concentrate feeding. It's really been very efficient at the use of concentrates. And obviously the efficiency of the use of concentrate is really a byword for being better at use of grass, really, and use of high quality silage. So more grass utilised, better quality silage in the winter period, lower amount of concentrate fed per kilo of milk produced, which is a critical thing for profitability. Higher milk solids percentages also. And maybe one important one that needs to be recognised, I suppose, among the average suppliers is that, part of the reason why the most efficient farms sell more milk is because their herds are more fertile. On average, the best guys calve their cows once every 375 days or thereabouts. The average guy, it's taken 410 to 415 days calving interval. Now, how does that relate to milk production? Very simply, the most efficient producers have cows that spend more days at peak lactation, they spend fewer days dry, they have fewer cows being recycled and hanging around effectively, not working as hard as they should be. So, the main thing there is that fertility, really, when we look at it in detail, fertility within a herd or between herds really seems to drive output on a per cow per year basis. Okay, now we often see this where we have herds that have really, really high milk yield potential, but they don't achieve it because the cows just simply don't calve often enough. And I think if there were two things to be focused on, it's reducing the calving interval back to about 375 days and driving more milk per kilo of concentrate fed rather than just more milk per se.
I think that's a really good point, and actually it was my next question for you, Joe, in terms of, you mentioned that the calving should be compact and, maybe starting off in mid to late September. What are the fertility KPIs? I know you mentioned a 375-day calving interval. Is there anything else that farmers should really push in the system for the winter milk side of things?
Yeah, I think, I suppose, Emma-Louise, the one that's we say 375-day calving interval, and all of these things look great on a page, and in theory we'd all agree, yeah, that's fine. But the big thing is, to me, and you see it over the years, is that unless there is control of the number of cows being recycled from one season to another, then progress probably won't be really made in the long run. Okay, what I mean by that is that, we've often heard it years ago where people would say that one of the big advantages of winter milk is, well, sure, if they're not in calf, I can move them into the next. I can move them into the next season, if you know what I mean. They can take the empty springs and move them to autumn, and take the empty autumns and move them to spring. Now that would say that you would imagine that should keep your culling rate low, but actually, and funny enough, when you look at the figures on it, the farms that have found themselves in a position where they're always recycling cows, their annual culling rate isn't actually improved. They still end up culling a lot of cows, and it keeps the big problem with that is it keeps infertile herds in the cow. It keeps infertile cows in the herd. You lose control of the calving pattern. You end up with too many cows calving in late spring, for example, and getting rolled over. And it means then that we don't get enough days in milk. Like if you late spring calving cows, not calving till the following autumn, 12 months, it's a long time spent in late lactation, which really drops your milk yield from relative potential. So one thing we've challenged people to do, and a lot of visiting groups into the herd in Johnstown, our big challenge for groups would be to reduce the percentage of cows recycled from one season to another to less than 10%. So fix that, ideally less than 5%, but as a starting point, say that no more than 10% of the herd would be recycled within a given year. And I think if we do that and limit the number of cows being recycled, the natural selection of subfertile cows falling out of the system will happen over time. And we've seen that over the years in the spring calving herds as well. Once you have high quality, high EBI replacement heifers coming through to replace those cows, you actually, over the period of 3 years, perhaps 3 or 4 years, you end up fixing the fertility problem. So one of the things that in Johnstown would be very strong on is to say, look, at 5% is the maximum number of cows that will be recycled from one season to the other. Anything else over that that's empty will be culled as empty, similar to what you would do in your compact spring calving system.
And I suppose a comment that you would hear from farmers in these scenarios, Joe, would be that, but she's a very good milker and she's still milking 20, 25 litres. Have you a comment, to respond to that?
Yeah, I suppose if she's a very good milker, that's the question, Emma-Louise. If you said, is a cow doing 25 kilos of milk a good milker? That particular cow that people always talk about probably has the capacity to do 40 kilos at peak. So really, instead of saying that you're gaining 25 kilos a day, you're losing 15 kilos a day. Because there could be a cow in that place of that animal doing more than 25. A lot of the farms we deal with that, if they thought that that's where cows would peak at 25 kilos or that's where the level would, they wouldn't be happy with it. Yet and all, it's still tolerable to have cows that are calved for 14 months doing that figure, if you know what I'm saying. So rather than focusing on what the individual animal has the capacity to do at 300 days in milk, look what you're losing relative to having more cows calved and more cows in early lactation. We all know that, and looking at lactation curves, that it's the first 200 days in milk where cows really put their productivity is highest. So really, the simple fact is what we want is more cows spending more time in the first 200 days in milk. And that's an old story. That's not unique to this country. If you look in the really intensive dairy systems in the States, for example, there's a huge effort made to have cows calving at least once every 12 and a half months. And the reason for that is that in order to maximise production from the farm, we need to have cows calving often enough to do it.
And I suppose that's a really, really good point, Joe. And when you say that you want them calving, every 375 days, you are getting more of those, 200 days, the first 200 days in milk, rather than milking a cow for, say, 420 days across one lactation. I get you on that.
I think so. And look at it, it's something that we've looked at that over hundreds of cows data through. The milk recording versus the delivered yields, Emma-Louise, and it's something that comes up a lot where herds that might have an 8,000 kilo recorded average, that's a 305 day equivalent average, may deliver closer to 6,000 kilos. So you're looking and saying, well, in reality, the herd is delivering 6,000 kilos but has the potential for 8,000 kilos. Now, what is the problem there? And the problem is not that the milk recording is inaccurate. The milk recording is very accurate, measured on a given day, but the yield is expressed as a 305-day yield rather than what the cow did in the calendar year. Now, we've looked at that over hundreds of lactation records, and we see there's a very, very strong relationship between calving interval and the gap between what the cow could milk versus what the cow does milk, if you know what I mean. So about 85 to 90% of the variation between what you think the cow's milking and what the cow's actually delivering is down to calving interval. So it's the one key thing that will drive productivity. And, you know, it's a way you must have the calving interval lower in order for cows to express their true potential to milk. Otherwise, we're producing, it's an expensive way and a less sustainable way to be using very high productivity cows potentially, but that are only tipping along in late lactation for too many days. It doesn't make sense if the aim is to maximize productivity from the herd. It's not something that we should be saying, well, you know, she's milking all right, but she should, you know, I would say she should be milking better. That would be my contention on it.
And then just moving on then to my final question, Joe, is in relation to, I suppose, the breeding and sire selection for herds. Now, you refer to Johnstown Castle, and we'd regularly catch up with Aidan on the show and, just discussing at different times of year the breeding seasons and what he's using in terms of sires. And he says there's not a whole lot of difference between the type of bull he's selecting for his spring calving and autumn calving cows. I suppose what is your take on that, and what are you targeting looking at bulls for winter milk?
Sure. Look, the thing to remember, like for the herd in Johnstown, we have looked at spring calving versus split calving versus block autumn calving, Emma-Louise. And just to give an idea, the very same genetics, the same herd genetics across all those three systems. Now, last year, our spring block herd would have done just over 500 kilos of milk solids in a spring system. The very same type of cow in the winter system did almost 580 kilos of milk solids, right? So the system itself changed the productivity of the cow by the tune of 70, 80 kilos of milk solids, right? Now, that's not leaving the economics out of it and whether there's feed cost differences and all the rest in there, but I think the important point for that, the reason I mentioned that is that I think sometimes people think that in order to achieve, 570, 580 kilos of milk solids, you must radically change the cow type. But the system, in a way, can deliver that. Block autumn calving or more autumn calving will, because of the change in the milk profile for the cows. So we would say, based on that if our winter systems are doing the 580 kilos of milk solids and our spring systems are doing close to the 500, and the cow type doesn't actually change that much. It's an interesting one, and lots of people we talk to on this would assume that all of the difference between herds is down to the breeding and that the feeding doesn't have much of an effect on milk yield. But on the other hand, the same people might tell you that the fertility is all down to feeding rather than the genetics. We would argue the other way around, that actually, in order to fix the fertility side of the equation, the genetics, really, really drives that. But we see a fair degree of capacity for that type of cow to respond to different feeding systems. So, for example, the herd in Johnstown at the moment, EBI is about 150, 153 to be exact. The milk subindex in the cow is about 50, the fertility subindex 60, and our kilos of milk in the proof is 80, 85 kilos of milk in the proof for the cows. So with that type of cow, as I say, our standard cows, over the herd average is about 7,300, 7,400, hitting close to 360 protein. We'd be very happy with that. But obviously, we want to drive it on. So the usual story, we're picking high EBI bulls, over 100 for fertility subindex is essential. We're targeting at least 25 kilos of milk solids in the bulls, if not more, given the quality of the bulls that's coming through. We pick a couple of bulls for calving ease with the heifers. The bulls will be a mix of genomic and daughter-proven. Some daughter-proven bulls we like, but a majority will be genomic to push on the rate of progress. mix and match a little bit on the milk subindex, milk kilos, to make sure the milkiest cows aren't being bred too high for milk, and that the very low ones are being brought up a little bit. So it's a fairly simple blend like that. So I would say high BI, make sure the fertility subindex is high, select on milk subindex rather than kilos of milk in proof. There's no evidence to say that, picking bulls, you need to have a certain number of kilos of milk in the proof. It's not really supported by the data. And make sure you use bulls that have calving ease proofs on your heifers. And it becomes very simple after that. At that point, you sort of sit back and watch the herd improve,
And I guess, look, picking up on that point, at 580 kilograms of milk solids, that's very high, and it's above the top 10% that we were talking about earlier on. And I suppose finally on that point, when we're talking about genetics and I suppose the future generation coming into the herd, when we look at heifers, you mentioned carryovers in terms of cows, and we do see some situations on farms where we breed heifers to calve down in September. They don't hold their inseminations, and we carry them on, so they're calving down at about 2.5 years of age, or maybe they roll into the following year and calve down at 3 years old. Are you seeing would you see a negative effect where this is occurring on farms, beyond calving down at 2 years old?
It is important to recognise, though, that in the winter milk sector, the rate of progress on solids has been excellent, Emma-Louise. I mean, it's gone up from 3.28 up to 3.42 for protein, for example. Calving interval has come down by about 2.5 weeks. There's lots of things have been improving over the last 6 or 7 years. So I wouldn't like people to be saying, it's all very negative. I think progress is being made in the right direction. I think that's important. But one area maybe that we'd say we're slightly disappointed with the progress would be on the percentage of heifers calving at 2 years old. It's still, the average winter milk producer calves about 45% of the heifers at 2 year old, which is too low. And there are implications of that for lifetime performance, for subsequent fertility. There's no doubt all the work done in Ireland, in the UK, elsewhere, would say that 2 year old heifers have a much better chance of long-term survival in the herd. So, if people are maybe slightly lower in EBI than they would like and they want to improve fertility, the easiest and the quickest win to improve cow survival in the herd is to insist on 2 year old calving. Okay, it definitely is. It's definitely something that's well worth chasing. It's definitely something that's achievable, but it does need a bit of work in the meantime. So, look, the protocols are all there. We know that our heifers need to be gaining about 20 kilos a month from birth in order to be meeting the targets. The key one is then, if you have heifers that are empty at the end of the breeding season and in any given season, our advice would be to cull those as empty rather than to hold on to them. And that's the sticky one, is the step of saying, okay, it's better to take my loss on those heifers rather than keeping them in the system long term. You're only talking about a small number of heifers anyway, I suppose, but still, we would rather clean it up and insist on the 2 year olds calving. But I understand at farm level, in the short term anyway, it might seem like a very expensive way of doing things. But at some point, if you make the efforts to grow the heifers to the right stage, the number of heifers that you will require to roll on will drop away very, very quickly. And one final point on that, Emma-Louise, I don't honestly think, looking at a lot of herds in the winter system, I don't think the issue is that heifers are failing to meet the targets for 2 year old calving in terms of weight. If anything, what I would see out there is that heifers are well on target, but people refuse to submit them because they believe them to be too small. Do you know what I'm saying? So I've seen it plenty of times where people have their heifers at 350, 360 kilos and are thinking, I'd like another 20 kilos on them. So learning what 340, 350 kilos looks like, and learning that is the optimum weight is the most important thing. And most of these lads are brilliant at growing animals and very, very good stockmen. They'll manage the herd, they'll manage the heifers very well, but it's just the case of knowing when to submit them is the main that's the main pinch point, I would say.
And I guess, Joe, look, you gave us a really nice rule of thumb in terms of 20 kilograms of live weight gain per month from birth. And as you say, the guidelines are out there, and it's maybe a simple thing of just weighing the heifers to give yourself the confidence that they are at target weight, ahead of breeding.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. It's the confidence to know that the heifers that stand in front of me are heavy enough, and you have to believe the scales then, Emma-Louise. That's the problem. I've seen it happen where people weigh them and still don't, they're too small. But they're too small relative to what you might be used to doing, but they're plenty big. And the data and everything that has been happened, and the farms that have switched over to that way have said, what they probably get is, ordinary enough performance as a first calver, but then from second calvers on, they will walk the older heifers off the place in terms of performance.
Yeah, and then finally, look, once they're at target weight and you do good heat detection, you should see good insemination rates, and it's just a little bit of discipline then looking at those heifers that haven't gone in calf and deciding to cull them. And look, I mean, again, there is temptation there. People say I've put the full 2 years into or the full, say, 15 months into rearing them at this stage, and I kind of want to hold on to them, but as you say, it's not proven to be profitable.
But really what you tend to see though is you tend to see either somebody gets 50% calved a 2-year-old or 100%, if you know what I'm saying. It's kind of once you get the system right, you're going to get pretty much all the heifer. You're going to end up with a couple of percent empty at the end. It's not going to be huge.
And Joe, we look forward to catching up and seeing more on the open day in Johnstown Castle on the 4th of September.
Thank you.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Joe Patton for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.